So good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining me for the August Savvy series. I appreciate you all taking the time to be with us for one of my, I wouldn't say most favorite, I've got some other favorite topics, but I think one of the most helpful topics that we present, and that's conflict management, which is not people-person skills, but how we can handle conflict management. Part of us handling ourselves and our emotions, but also I've got some at the end, 7 tips for how to manage conflict. So what we will cover tonight, not only kind of this idea of what savviness is, but we'll define conflict. We'll go through what's functional, which there is functional conflict. You can actually have conflict that is good and productive. Just because it has the word con in it doesn't mean that it's bad. Also, the dysfunctional side of it, where conflict is not good. How to go about resolving it in terms of different styles. Not one style does not fit all kind of situations. We also will go through how you choose that style, what kind of variables come with how you manage conflict, and those 7 steps that I mentioned in terms of tips and tricks. So please feel free to ask questions at any time or make comments in the questions box so I can share those with others. I may not mention you by name, but mention that you shared some information. And I'll also post 3 questions during the webinar to get your response so that I know that you're engaged, and that's for our CPE process. If you are interested in getting CPE credit for tonight, this is a requirement of NASBA. And so when we have those, please type your response into the questions box, and we'll track attendance and responses so we can send you credit within 2 weeks of tonight. So again, please ask questions as we go along as they're relevant. I would love to answer questions that way as we go along. So let's get started. So when we talk about savviness, I think the term, and sometimes a term that gets, I think, overused, is the whole idea of soft skills, really. And that's essentially what all of the Savvy series covers. And it's really being savvy in terms of how you interact with people, how you are very self-aware, and how you use that to your best advantage. And really, those are critical competencies for being successful. It's not just knowing how to do your job, but it's being successful at working with others to do your job. And so that's where we wanted to offer our members, AFWA members, and really any woman in business, the opportunity to look at their capacity for dealing with others to be not only the best accountant or finance professional, but the best female professional in their industry and what they're doing by being a more well-rounded professional. And so those are things that can really serve you in all sorts of roles, whether it's professional, it's personal, it's volunteer roles, you name it. So we really wanted to provide our members with that opportunity. And when you look at soft skills training, I think this was in Forbes, that boosts productivity and retention. So things like communication skills, exactly what we're talking about tonight with conflict resolution or managing conflict, boosts productivity and retention by 12% and delivers a 250% ROI. So if you're just investing a few dollars, like for this webinar, members get this for free, AFWA members, but the general public can actually register for these webinars, and they pay only $25 for them, but the ROI on that is really exponential if you look at it. So when we look at overall conflict, what is conflict? And you can see the definition there on your screen, but let's break that down a little bit. In terms of expressed struggle, that means all people involved must know that some disagreement exists. So if you're mad at somebody and they don't really know it, it's not a conflict. That's more of you're just disagreeing with somebody and not telling them, which I think is more than half of our problem when we have a conflict with someone or something. When you have perceived compatible goals, when people perceive that their goals are mutually exclusive, then conflict is maybe real, but maybe not necessary. And then we also have perceived scarce rewards. So there's not enough of something to go around. So you may disagree or have a conflict over staff time, resources in terms of money, those kind of things are what we might think of as something that may not be enough to go around with resources and rewards in that regard. Independent, interference from other parties. And so sometimes we do have this perception of, yeah, we're all in this together, and then other times we don't. And then also inevitability. Research shows that in both happy and unhappy relationships have conflict. So whether it's personal or professional, happy and unhappy relationships have conflicts, but we just manage them in different ways. So if we have a conflict in a professional relationship in which we're not happy with the way a project's going, you're not happy with an assignment, there can be conflict, and even there can be conflict in a personal relationship where you're totally agreeing with somebody, but you just don't see eye to eye on one thing. But then there's also several ways to look at conflict, and there's good conflict and bad conflict. So how I mentioned the definition is also how we can break down functional and dysfunctional. So when we look at functional conflict, that means we have integration of each other's ideas, as opposed to the dysfunctional side, which we'll go over. Cooperation in terms of, yes, I'm willing to give a little, you're willing to give a little, or we'll just work on it ourselves, trying to figure this out. We'll also confirm the other person's viewpoint, but we may not necessarily agree with it, but we understand the other person's viewpoint. We just may not agree. But then there's also, in terms of functional conflict, we come to an agreement. And that's where we have resolution, everything moves down the line. But you can also have de-escalation in terms of, okay, you see each side of the conflict and viewpoint, but we take a little bit of the emotion out of it. We talk through things as opposed to being super passionate and unable to hear about the other person. And then there's also focusing, in which we'll focus on the core reason for a conflict as opposed to some of the ancillary reasons. What's the true reason for disagreeing with somebody on a budget item? Is it really the money, or is it something else? And then also foresight. You can have a conflict in terms of where you're going, but if it's in the long run, say in the short term, you may have that conflict of saying, well, this is not going to work in the next month. But if it's something that has a benefit a year down the road, how can you handle that now to be able to be more forethinking? But when we have dysfunctional conflict, we also have things like polarization. So people just being on one side or the other, nothing in the middle. We oppose each other constantly. We, instead of confirming the other person, we disconfirm, we disavow. We also coerce. Instead of agreeing with somebody, we try to coerce them, which starts getting into ethical issues. We also escalate. So rather than using collaborative language and rather than trying to kind of take the emotions down, we keep ratcheting them up. We start attacking people, using language that might be offensive, and so on. We also, instead of focusing, we drift. We try to get somebody's focus off of the main issue. And we also have that short-sightedness. Again, we may disagree on something, but if we can kind of get to the conclusion where our organization or our group or project is better off in the long run, then that can come to a good solution, and that was good conflict, as opposed to you're thinking about a short-term solution the next, say, 3 to 6 months, and that's what you're focused on. So that's where conflict can be dysfunctional. And then regardless of whether conflict is positive or is functional or dysfunctional, you can have positive or negative results. And that positive can have several things. You can have a reward for successfully facing the challenge. You can also it leaves everybody with a feeling better about themselves and each other, having come to a resolution, having come to an answer. We also learn more about each other's needs and how they can be satisfied. So if you know that so-and-so on a project really needs more reinforcement of their ideas, whereas you might need more in terms of just capacity, time, resources, that might just be the opportunity and what comes out to be a positive result. Also, the relationship strengthens. If you can work past, disagreements, you always come out a little bit better on the other side. And then last but not least, you have a safe outlet for feelings of frustration and sometimes aggression, but in a way to which nobody feels threatened. Nobody is taking it personally. And that's kind of that you feel like, you can voice a concern without necessarily thinking that, oh, I shouldn't say that because I'm going to offend somebody, or I shouldn't say that because I know it's not going to work out that way, so why bother? So having that safe outlet is a really great result. Whereas on the negative side, no one gets what they originally wanted. So we'll talk about how we manage conflict or conflict styles in just a minute, but that's where it's just a complete lose-lose. Nobody gets anything. And then also in terms of negative results, today's victor, so whoever wins that argument, whoever wins that conflict, may suffer tomorrow at the hands of the original loser. So if you win and I lose, tomorrow is a different day. And, if you're needing resources that I have, maybe I don't make them available anymore. Maybe I don't play well anymore. I make it more difficult. And that can be a negative result of a conflict that doesn't end well. Dysfunctional conflicts also threaten the future of a relationship. Workplace, people ultimately, and I know this has been cited in so many places, like from SHRM, the Society for HR Managers, and so on, that people don't leave a company because they don't like what they do, or sometimes they don't even leave because of what they're getting paid. They leave because of usually either a supervisor in their relationship or coworkers or peers. And so that kind of dysfunctional conflict that may threaten a relationship may mean that somebody walks away from the table and you lose an employee, you lose their talents, you lose their capacity. And then also dissolving a relationship in the face of conflict is not very satisfying. It's very defeating. And I think a lot of us may think personal in this regard, but if you have or are working in a partnership kind of role, it's not satisfying ever to be in that way when you're dissolving that partnership or that relationship. So just kind of after an overview of general conflict, both good and bad, what is the last conflict that you had? What was it about? Was it an argument with a coworker? So this is our first NASPA check-in. What was the last conflict you had about, or what was the main focus of your last conflict? Both good or bad. You had a disagreement and you worked through it, or something that you may have had a situation where both sides lost something. Personal, professional, you name it. What was your conflict about, the last one that you had? And you don't have to be so specific and air dirty laundry. You can say it was something about a resource or something about time, shifting of responsibilities, that kind of thing. So some interesting and awesome responses. Setting priorities, that can be a pretty big conflict. People don't see eye to eye. Miscommunication, professional disagreement. Ooh, ethics. Oh, that's a tough one. Ethics violations, and sometimes that's not necessarily a two-sided conflict. Employee compensation, not seeing eye to eye on value. All right. So first question of tonight. Please put in the questions box for your CPE credit. What was your last conflict about, personal or professional? Someone who reads emails and blows it way out of proportion. That I can understand that one. I think we all can on that one. Somebody who just doesn't want to read through some of the information that you sent. Which I guess the positive side is but you might sum up things a little bit more quickly knowing how they react to emails. Who knows, but just speculating. All right, so let's move on from our first NASBA question, and you can still answer that as we go along. Now that we understand the basics of conflict, both positive and negative, the functional and dysfunctional, let's look at conflict styles. So when it comes to conflict styles, essentially what that is how we handle conflict. And that's on two spectrums. That's concern for self and concern for others. And that's how we handle conflict. And where everything kind of meets in the middle, or it's in one of those four corners. So let's look at those conflict styles. The first one we have is avoidance, which is essentially lose-lose. And what that means is that people not necessarily ignore or stay away from conflict, and they also have a pessimistic attitude towards that conflict. Avoiders put up with the status quo. They know something's not right, but they just avoid it and think, oh, I'll just bury my head in the sand and move on. Now, however, avoidance can be helpful, and there are a few cases where that is true, where risk of speaking up is too great. So say, if I speak up about this issue, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my pension or what have it. So is that really worth bringing an issue to the table? Avoidance can also be helpful when conflict is not worth the effort. Is it going to take too much time to work through an issue than it is to just ignore it, take it off your plate, and move on with something that might be productive? And third is when avoidance might be helpful is when the issue is temporary. If you know this is going to go away in a week, maybe it's something to do with rates, or it's temporary in terms of the market. If avoiding it means that it's it's going to go away, not like avoiding it in terms of you hope it goes away, but it's something that's very short term, then avoidance may be the best opportunity there. And then next we have accommodation. So that's where one person wins and one person loses something. And accommodation can sometimes enhance a relationship, both professional and personal. But we have others have their way rather than asserting our own viewpoint. So if you're looking at it from your perspective, that would mean that you lose and the other person, quote, wins or has their way. Now, it's important to examine the roles, and we'll talk about culture a little bit and how culture kind of influences these styles, but low context cultures view avoidance or accommodation as something that's not positive. So when I say a low context culture, we usually think of Western or American cultures as low context, and that's where we view avoidance or accommodation in not such a positive light. We think of it as being, in kind of general terms and what we've heard, oh, well, if they just ignore it, they're just being ignorant, or they're just walking away from something rather than dealing with something head on. And that's really kind of an American perspective of you got to deal with a problem head on and just face it. Whereas in high context culture, avoiding or being accommodating is what goes along with, say, proper etiquette or what's acceptable in a culture. Usually when we think of high context cultures, we think of Asian or African, sometimes South American kinds of cultures, but a lot of Western cultures, the US, Canada, sometimes Mexico, not always, but also, say, Australia. Those are low context cultures where we think of avoiding something as kind of being weak in a way. And then the next one we have is competition. And we as Americans are really good at this one. We win and somebody else loses. And so we have a high concern for self. So remember, we had the two perspectives, ourself and others. I think this is really kind of ingrained a little bit in American culture, our fascination with sports, which, soccer can be just one of those. And we've bred this necessity for competition. And it also kind of that bid for control. I have to be in charge. This whole idea or concept that leadership is being ahead of everybody, as opposed to, if you're a leader of a group, being a follower is just as important. That's slowly catching on, but we're really more so in that competition mindset in that American or Western cultures. And I think kind of one that we are used to a little bit more than some others. And then one that I see with a lot of folks in general anymore, because they don't want to directly face a conflict, is passive aggressiveness. And so that's when a communicator or someone expresses dissatisfaction in kind of a disguised manner, in that kind of snarky, sarcastic, sometimes, not always, but in that kind of realm. And really, it's kind of what a lot of people would dub as crazy making. It's tactics that somebody takes on that are designed to punish the other person without direct confrontation. So that might be guilting them, or nonverbal expressions, or loud sighs, rolling of eyes. Sometimes people use humor for that. Sometimes they give like a pained expression, the furrowing of an eyebrow, kind of like squinting at somebody. You don't have to always be verbal when being passive aggressive, but it still happens. It happens a lot, and depending on the business role that you might be in, you might see it more than others. And then almost last but not least, we're kind of getting towards the other direction, and something that sometimes is quite scary, direct aggression. And so that's something that has a severe impact on the target in terms of, and honestly, anymore in the political realm, this is where I think we'll see it the most, regardless of what side of policy you fall on. Character attacks, competency attacks, personal appearance attacks, wishing bad luck on someone, hoping that something bad happens to somebody, teasing them, ridiculing them, threatening them, sometimes nonverbal communication in terms of like fist shaking, waving arms. And that can have, and I think this of course is one that you may not see as much in the professional realm, but you may see a lot with, say, teenagers, or if any of you work with middle schoolers or high schoolers, sometimes that teasing, that ridicule, bullying is more of the term anymore, has a severe impact on the target. And that verbal aggression can also have a physical impact. If somebody is so distraught about a direct aggression, it's even not physical, but all just verbal, it can have significant impact on the person that's receiving it, and can cause a real destructive downward spiral for both sides. I mean, somebody who might be very aggressive may see themselves lose colleagues or friends, be isolated, and so that may start a downward spiral for them. So in no way is usually direct aggression ever the way we go with solving conflicts. So that's kind of the extreme of, I think, low sense of self and low sense for anyone else, or concern for others. And so then we have another one, compromise, negotiated lose-lose. So we both give up a little to come to a solution that we want. We sacrifice a little bit, or a little bit of the goals that we're trying to achieve. Now, I will say that compromise or negotiated lose-lose is not always seen in a positive light, because in theory, both sides lose something, and costs involved can be great if someone is compromising, say, personal values or ethics. And then when compromises are satisfying and successful, that's when we start labeling them as collaboration as opposed to compromise. So rather than feeling kind of let down, we are excited about what's coming forward. So we see that more as a win-win. we're all satisfied and happy with the direction of something is going, as opposed to feeling like we're not getting everything that we want. So there is a little bit of difference between that compromise and then collaboration. And I think win-win is where we find ourselves in a more ideal situation, because that's where we have high concern for the other person, but we also have high concern for ourselves, and finding a way to come with an answer for everyone's issues. And however, it's not always either possible or appropriate. And we also know that it's very time consuming. And that's what makes it cooperative or collaborative and cooperative, if you will, conflicts or resolutions to be rare, because they are that time consuming. If you have a decision that has to be made quickly, that's where you may not get as much collaboration. You may find you're more in a compromise situation, just because you have to make a decision, you have a deadline to meet. And so it's really kind of a choice that you have to make depending on the situation. So when we look at all of these different styles, right? So we had the avoidance, we had accommodation, we have competition, we have passive aggressive, direct aggression, compromise, and collaboration. Regardless of the kind of conflict that you see yourself in, of all of those styles, this is our second NASBA check-in, which is one that you usually take? And what's your go-to style? Not knowing what you have a conflict about. Is it avoidance, accommodation, competition, passive aggressiveness, direct aggression as opposed to passive, compromise, or collaboration? And I will say it always depends on the situation, but I think sometimes personality types have a preference. And I think if I had to say what my go-to is more of a compromise, that negotiated lose-lose, which isn't always the positive, but feeling like you have to give a little, both sides have to give a little, as opposed to seeing it from a win-win. And quick question in terms of the check-ins and where you respond, you do put that in the questions box. So there's a good check-in or question, Helen, you're putting your answers in the right place. So what is the conflict style that you think you move to the most often? And again, if you have questions as we go along, say about the different conflict styles, how you should handle things, please put that in the questions box. So if we're ready to move on to our next little chunk of information, and probably something after you know all of those different styles, after you understand compromise versus competition versus accommodation and so on, which one do you choose in the situation that you're in? And so you're always going to have to do that assessment of, so, okay, what do I pick? What is best for the situation? And really, just depending on what you're finding yourself in, and even though, say, like my go-to might be that compromise as opposed to collaboration, as much as I would love collaboration, and I think we all would love collaboration, sometimes I hinge on that more of compromise because of a certain situation. But there are other times where if I know it's like that battle you should not fight kind of deal, I'll avoid. So let's see which style we should use in which situation. And that being said, there is no single best way to handle conflict. And really, conflict is relational. So it's always person to person, right? It's not person to machine. If you're responding to an email or have issue with an email, there's another person on the side of that email. So it's all about relationships and relational. And that is where the character is determined by the way people interact in that conflict, and how we go about interacting with each other. And that's what I mean by relational. It depends on the other person, right? Someone that you've known for a long time, someone that you've known for a short time, and so on. And then also, people develop a relational conflict style that is more comfortable to them. So we have a pattern, whether or not we recognize it, we have a pattern of managing disagreements that might repeat itself over time. If I know I'm a person who would be more willing to do compromise, I'll see that in those results. So there's some things to consider, 3 things. You have to consider the situation, the other person or other group, and your goal. Why are you in this relationship, or why are you working with this person? Are you interacting with them for a specific outcome? So again, 3 things to consider when you're looking at these different styles. The situation that you're in, and that I think is the most important. The other person, how long have you, say, known them? What do you know in terms of their personality in which you know they're going to react to something? If you know that somebody is going to be, say, somewhere in between passive aggressive and aggressive, and you know that's their response to a certain response to a situation, regardless of what it is it in your best interest to say, be in a avoidance mode? Is it? And that's something you're going to have to determine for yourself. And then again, your goals, situation, the other person, and your goals. Those are the 3 things we have to consider when we look at which style to use. And then when we look at all those different styles, there are things that we can think about in terms of how we choose again. So we look at 3 different things. A complementary conflict style. So that's where both you and the other person have different conflict styles, but mutually reinforce those behaviors. So someone may be, say, very avoidant, right? But maybe you are the one who is able to respond in a very collaborative, or even am I thinking here? Not collaborative. So if they're thinking in terms of avoidance, you might be a little bit more collaborative, or you might be a little bit more on the compromise side, right? Just to make them feel better about being in this situation and coming to the table, as opposed to completely stepping away from the situation. Then you also have symmetrical conflict style. So you use the same tactics. If the other person's being passive aggressive, then you're passive aggressive. Is that necessarily positive? I think that's up for debate. If someone else avoids, then you avoid. Everybody just keeps ignoring the situation and the outcome. But then again, also if you're being collaborative and they're being collaborative, you're compromising and they're compromising. So that's where we have symmetrical. So that little shape in the middle is symmetrical. That's where we use the same style or tactics. And then parallel conflict style. So that shifts between both complementary and symmetrical. We might have the complete opposite, but kind of come together in the same one. So you might be in a relationship where you use different, both personal and professionally, different types of conflict style. But if the issue is one thing, you kind of act this way, and so on. And kind of the complementary, fight-flight style, if you will, is common in many unhappy relationships of all types: work, professional, personal. So, one person, sticks around to kind of battle it out with the other person. It's like, I'm out. I am completely avoiding the situation. And then when we have, say, threats and insults, those kind of lead to something that just spirals out of control and something that we need to expect. And so when partners withdraw, a complementary de-escalating spiral results. So really the relationship is not what it used to be. Whereas more of those symmetrical styles, again, we're using the same kind, can be beneficial when people communicate assertively, not aggressively, but they assert themselves with the understanding that they have a concern for themselves or appreciation for themselves, but also can empathize with the other person. We listen to the other person's concerns, but then we also work together in the same manner to resolve them. And yes, that is the ultimate goal. When it comes to conflict, disagreeing, that's our ultimate goal. Does that take time? Does that take effort? Absolutely. But see, this is where, and this is kind of a little bit of an extension of aggression, we have toxic conflict. And that's where four things happen. Someone is critical of the other person, then the other person starts getting defensive, in which that person can then lead into criticizing the other person that has just criticized them. Contempt for the situation, feeling like, oh, well, this is just not going to work anymore. You have anger or just total disregard in a way that ends in contempt. And then also stonewalling, you just kind of sit there and listen and don't say anything, don't respond, and so on. I wouldn't say necessarily silent treatment, but I guess that's the best kind of response that you might be able to come up with in terms of what stonewalling may be. And that again is going to depend on the situation. But toxic conflict, I wouldn't say that's something that we don't see very often, but it's one I think that we all try to avoid between either professional and personal relationships and situations. But one that I don't think anybody wants to take on. And I think if you're feeling like somebody is intentionally and wants to be that defensive person or wants to be the person that criticizes constantly, that's when you have to assess, is this a good fit for this group, or is this really going to work for me in terms of working with this person or being with this person? So there is kind of the extreme of the extreme when it comes to conflict, and something hopefully you may not see very often. But there are a few things that can change what styles we choose. And the first of those, which I think is very applicable for ASWA and usually women who join in on this series, is gender. And so really when it boils down to it, we perceive that there are greater differences than actually exist. And research shows that, and probably the assumption that all of us would make, is that males are use more competing behaviors with same-sex peers, or men are more competing with other men and more avoiding behaviors with women. On the whole, that's just a general kind of perspective from research results. Men will compete with other men, but they'll avoid stuff with women. And women are more concerned, on the whole, not always, but in general, women are more concerned with maintaining relationship during a conflict. So we might give a little, and I think that's where we might be more apt to compromise, and sometimes even go into that avoidance, because we would rather keep a friend, keep a coworker, work with the same supervisor or peer than tick somebody off and lose them completely. And that's just an overall view and observation of how gender affects conflict styles. Is this always the case? No, but on the whole, that's what we find when it comes to conflict and gender. And then the second one being culture. So culture will really, really affect how you approach conflict, especially if it's similar culture. So if you've got all, say, Americans in your group versus all Asian or all South American, Hispanic, and so on, culture is going to play a big factor in how you handle conflict. And if you throw in a language barrier, into all of that, that also kind of complicates things a little bit more. So when we have individualistic cultures, so again, American, Canadian to a degree, Australian, very Western, so, you know, Great Britain to a degree, those are more competing conflict styles. That's just what we have been ingrained with, really. That's, you know, quote, the American way. You gotta, you know, forge ahead, forge ahead. Whereas in collective cultures, so those that are, again, high context cultures, collective cultures, which you usually think of more Asian and African, some Hispanic, you see more accommodating, more compromising, and also a little bit more problem-solving styles. And so the assertive approach, or sometimes considered the American way of dealing with conflict, is not the norm in the rest of the world. So if you're dealing with a lot of, say, international business, your company is one that deals with, say, export-import, all that kind of stuff, you'll see this more than others. And so the approach to conflict, that's part biological makeup. That's how you're raised versus personality. And some of how you're going to approach conflict based on culture is going to be from that self-concept. And sometimes that can be a little bit more powerful than culture. And, you know, those kind of collective cultures, you know, that look at more accommodating, compromising, problem solving together, collaborating. Here's what I find very interesting. And those collective cultures or high context cultures, the first person to raise their voice, the first person that loses their cool in a way, loses the argument. And so conflict in that regard and in that cultural context, there's more focus on face saving, more towards honor, if you will. And I think a lot of us can see that in a lot of ways with the different groups that we may deal with or manage or be in contact on a regular basis. So culture and gender both play a huge part on which conflict style you're more apt to lean towards. Not necessarily always the one that you'll pick, but the one that you may lean more towards. So our third and final NASBA check-in before our 7 ways of conflict resolution in practice. And just a hypothetical, and if you are not an AFWA member, if you look at events or conferences or professional development that you attend in your organization, if AFWA or the organization that you're a member of, any organization, offered a mostly technical, so for AFWA members, tax, audit, finance, you name it, offered a fall conference that was more technical and a leadership type academy or event in the spring, would you attend both or just one? And if you would only attend one, which one would it be? Just hypothetically, we ask these questions to kind of gauge interest and see what you all would be really interested in. Put more focus on the technical or your own leadership and I would say a little bit more personal development, but you all know we have personal development at our national conference that tends to lean a little bit more technical. But you also know we all want to build you all as great leaders. So which one would you be more interested in, or both? I would love to see both, but if you have interest or ability and only able to do one, we want to know which one that might be. All right, so in our last 14 minutes, we're going to look at conflict resolution in practice. It's one thing to say, yes, I know which kinds of conflict styles there are. I know I could avoid. I know I could compete. I know I could be passive aggressive. How do you choose? We know kind of a little bit about which ones, but how do we go about practicing conflict resolution? So there are a couple things to keep in mind when we go through these 7 steps. You have to share your needs with the other person, and that's part of the 7 steps, but also choosing to use I language. And I think that's above all one of the most important things when talking through, saying, this is how I feel, this is how I think, as opposed to presenting your opinion as fact. Because I hate to break it to you, your opinion is not fact. And so you have to use that I language so that the other person knows that this is your perspective, as opposed to a perspective that you're either assuming or putting on someone else. So first and foremost, you have to define your needs, and also ask what the other person's needs are. If you're trying to get through, say, a big project as a team within your firm, and you're not agreeing on, or not seeing eye to eye on how you should get to the outcome, remembering, or at least bringing back to the forefront, what's the need of trying to get through this disagreement. If that ultimate goal and need is to accomplish this project with XYZ and within X amount of time, that's at the forefront. And so sometimes we lose sight of what the needs are of a relationship or discussion, conflict, effort, you name it. Second, it's one thing to know what your needs are, but it's another thing to say to the other person, and sometimes the shared need, you just have to remind each other of it. But if it's a one-on-one conflict, say, they may have lost sight of what their needs are and what your needs are. So in kind of the hubbub of rhetoric, if you will, and sometimes you may need to put it in writing. I'm a pen to paper person, and so I got to write it down first. So I will define my needs and then share them with the other person. Sometimes that will trigger the other person to realize, oh wait, okay, I have needs too, and that's where the conflict is coming from, because my needs aren't exactly what your needs are from this situation. And so that will, I think, trigger sometimes, if they haven't even thought about it, their list of needs and what they need to accomplish. So then, of course, we're going to listen to the other person's needs. Now, this is why I say write them down, because we are all guilty of hearing and not listening. And so if you've been on some of the other Savvy series, especially around communication, we are so guilty of hearing and not listening. You cannot listen if you are talking. You cannot think when you are talking. So when you are hearing and being receptive to the person's needs, you need to not be thinking about what you're fixing for dinner, what time to pick up the kids, if you need to take something to the dry cleaners, oh wait, traffic. No, this has to be a sole focus to be actually listening, not hearing. All right. So listen to the other person's needs and digest them. And that's where I say write them down, because you can put your list next to their list and say, okay, that's where you can start to see, okay, which kind of solution or which kind of conflict style is going to work here. If these are completely different sets of needs, is it something where you compromise, you collaborate, or is it something where this just may not work? And that's not necessarily avoiding, but that's more realization around kind of this isn't something that's going to be feasible. And so that in itself is, I think, personally, I think is a win-win to be able to come to that realization, because that's a big realization. And then after you have listened to their needs and have fully understood your needs, you come up with solutions. What's the answer? If I know that I need to be able to reach, 10 hours of client time, and you can only pay me, and this is totally hypothetical, I'm just pulling this out of the air, and you can only pay me for 5 hours, what do we come up with? And maybe my need to work for those 10 hours and your ability to pay for 5 is what it is. and you have to make the decision that you're going to walk away, right? Or the solution can be maybe meet in the middle. Maybe you try to figure out, okay, if I only can do 5 hours, what can I do in those 5 hours that's priority? That maybe that's the solution. You know they can only handle compensating you for 5 hours, so you got to figure out how to do what you can in 5 hours. Does that mean you necessarily do 10 hours worth of work in 5 hours? No, but you are able to prioritize things. So coming up with that solution, or at least brainstorming solutions, this is kind of the philosophy that we have in the ASWA headquarters, is when we're trying to find a solution, this doesn't necessarily come out of conflict, but when we're trying to find a solution for a problem, we're trying to create something, we throw it up on the wall. And so, and that's not even, and brainstorming is not evaluating responses while you're coming up with them, which is hard to do, but putting up everything that comes out of your mouth or mind, how can you solve it? And then evaluating all of those. How can we achieve what we need to in, say, the timeline that we've got? So if you do have a timeline, what's the deadline? And then back up from there as to the activities that you're going to do. What do we have in terms of, if it's something that involves expenditures, what do we have in terms of budget? Also in terms of solutions, do you need outside resources? Do you need some expertise from another field, or a perspective from somebody else? Do you need, say, a partner's involvement? That may figure into the possible solutions that you have, right? And you may go from there and say, okay, here's our top 3 possible solutions, which might have the best outcome. And then, of course, you implement them. That's pretty self-explanatory. But implement that solution with the understanding of your conflict style, the other person's behavior, what will be the best outcome for you to achieve. And then this is a little bit like SMART goals. You follow up on the solution in terms of, okay, was that really the best one? Do we need to go take a step backwards to make it work? If the solution that you have doesn't pan out, what was the second best? And do you have time to come to the table with something else? But again, all the ways that you go through these steps in terms of handling those conflicts and deciding solution which involves your conflict style, choose a suitable time and place. So again, something that's not threatening to you or the other person, or your group and another group, your company, another company. And again, use I language. I can't stress that enough in terms of making sure that the other person doesn't feel threatened by saying, this is what I think, or this is what I feel, as opposed to, well, this is such and such, this is how it is, when it may be your opinion or your thought process. And that's kind of the best way to get somebody to move away from the table, and then you may not have the result that you want. So when it comes to conflict resolution and really managing it, being the best possible person in terms of handling it, I've got some resources for you in addition to tonight's webinar. These are some of my favorite resources. And again, these are on the slides that you can download. And if for some reason you're having technical difficulties with downloading them from your GoToWebinar panel, let me know and I can email these to you. These are my 3 favorite books: The Anatomy of Peace, ConCom, and Resolving Everyday Conflict. Not something that I'm saying you have to go and run out and buy, but these are the ones on my shelf that I go to in terms of how I approach conflict, or trying to find ways of coming across something. So we have our last 5 minutes or so. So I will open it up to questions as my dogs tell you hello and wish you all well. So you can put any questions that you have in the questions box, and while you are typing those, just a reminder that the Women Who Count conference is coming to the Westin Alexandria outside of Washington, D.C. in October. If you have not registered and realized you have missed the early bird deadline, please email me. please email me, and we'll figure out how to possibly save you from the regular rate and to the early bird rate. And then also, just as a reminder, please connect with us on social media. We would love to hear your insights and share some great stuff. So in terms of questions, we've got some good ones. How do you ever, sorry, my dogs are hearing all sorts of fun stuff. I apologize. How do you overcome workplace negativity? So the one thing, and this is what I personally do, and it's kind of a little bit of combo of avoidance and kind of knowing how I react to things. I overcome it by at least listening and understanding what the person is negative about, and seeing, okay, well, why are they thinking that way? And then offering them, sometimes not even like a alternative, but just being listening. That's the first and foremost, is just being a listening ear. And then if it's at all possible, offering them solutions. And if it's not, giving, them, I'm really sorry that's happening. I really feel for you. I've been there for myself. That can dispel, at least on the individual side. Now, if it's a morale issue, I think that's one in which I think you really do have to sometimes confidentially approach HR, whether that's, say, an anonymous note or actually approaching your HR professional and saying that there is an overall issue with workplace morale, but also coming to it with a solution and understanding where the issue is coming from. Is it because of salary? Is it because of inconsistent use of policies? Is it because the company isn't doing well based on metrics that it finds important? So I think first and foremost, it kind of goes back to those 7 steps of what's the need and where are things stemming from? Where's the negativity coming from if it's an overall general workplace morale issue? But if it's on the individual level, I find what works best for me is being a listening ear. And if I have any advice or I've been there and done that, I can at least share with the person. And if I can't, I can at least empathize. And then another great question, do you have some approaches to dealing with defensiveness? So I will tell you, and this is a really great question, Helen, because I've had to deal with some of that. Honestly, some of our, and rightly so, sometimes some of our members can be defensive because they don't want to see some change, and I can completely understand that. When it comes to defensiveness, what I do first, and again, I think this is the best win-win of everything, is just listen to what they're saying. And sometimes if what their viewpoint is, I think that's 110% the way to go about doing a lot of things, is just saying, being a listening ear. Some people just need to get stuff off their chest, and that's why they sound defensive. So first and foremost, that listening. But then providing solutions, and this kind of goes back a little bit to that workplace negativity question also, because that's why people get defensive, right? They don't want to lose their job, they don't want to lose their salary, they don't want to lose any stability, and people get defensive because they don't want to lose that. So when people are getting defensive, I think also go back to that I language, and when you approach, say, an idea or a suggestion, I wouldn't say downplay some of the language, but come at it from, I hear what you're saying, I understand where you're coming from, here's what I think, maybe this is the solution. But also in the same regard, once you've heard someone's complaints or why they're dissatisfied or why they're defensive, actually tell them, thank you, I appreciate your perspective, thank you for sharing that with me, because I had no idea. I think that when the old adage of killing people with kindness is true when it comes to defensiveness, because usually people are defensive because they just want to be heard. And so giving a solution where you can and going back to that I language, I think is the win-win there. So some really good questions. I really appreciate those tonight, guys. So if you do have any other questions or want to hit me up with some ideas or how you approach something, I'm more than happy to provide some insights. If you are attending tonight for CPE and have responded to those questions, we'll get those processed within 2 weeks. And I appreciate you attending tonight. Hope this has been very helpful. You can contact us anytime at headquarters for anything that you need for ASWA members. And I hope you all have a great evening and a wonderful weekend, and see you all Monday, and hope you have, or at least see some of you Monday. And if you, again, have not registered for conference yet, it is past the early bird deadline. We would love to see you there. Let me know if you had any issues with, say, registering and you didn't meet the early bird deadline or anything, and we can see how we can fix that for you. So I hope you all have a great evening and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.